What if I told you that somewhere in Europe, there are 3 graves with the same name carved into 3 different headstones? What if I told you that each of these graves contains the same woman's bones, yet she died only once? And what if I told you that this woman spent more time underground while alive than most people spend in their entire lifetimes? This is the story of Magdalena Reyes, a woman who became Europe's most unwilling traveler. Journeying from grave to grave across 3 different countries, not by choice, but by a medical condition so rare and terrifying that it fooled doctors, priests, and gravediggers across the continent. Each grave had her name, and each coffin had her bones. But Magdalena Reyes wasn't just buried alive once. She was buried alive 3 times, in 3 different countries, over the span of 7 years. And somehow, impossibly, she survived them all. Our story begins in 1847, in a small village outside Barcelona, Spain. Magdalena was the daughter of a local blacksmith. Known throughout the village for her unusual beauty and her even more unusual affliction. Since childhood, she had suffered from what the village doctor called the sleeping death episodes, where she would fall into such a deep death-like state that no pulse could be detected, no breath could be seen, and her body would grow cold as winter stone. Today, we might recognize this as catalepsy, an extremely rare neurological condition that can cause complete muscle rigidity and an almost undetectable heartbeat. But in 1847, rural Spain, it was nothing short of supernatural. The first time it happened, Magdalena was only 19 years old. She had been helping her mother with the evening meal when she suddenly collapsed at the kitchen table. Her pulse vanished, her breathing stopped, and within hours, her skin had taken on the grey pallor of death. The village priest was summoned, last rites were given, and by the following morning, a simple wooden coffin had been constructed. But here's where our story takes its first dark turn. As they lowered Magdalena into the earth of the small cemetery, behind the village church, her younger sister Maria heard something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She heard scratching, faint, desperate scratching coming from beneath the ground. Maria begged the priest to dig up the grave, but he refused, claiming it was merely the sound of settling earth. For 3 days and 3 nights, Maria camped beside her sister's grave, listening to those terrible scratching sounds grow weaker and weaker, until finally, they stopped altogether. It was a traveling merchant who saved Magdalena's life. He had heard Maria's desperate pleas and, having seen similar cases in his travels across Europe, convinced the reluctant villagers to exhume the coffin. When they pried open the lid, they found Magdalena weak, dehydrated, but miraculously alive. Her fingernails were broken and bloody from clawing at the wooden coffin lid, and scratches covered the interior of her makeshift tomb. The village was divided. Some called it a miracle, others whispered of witchcraft. But Magdalena's family knew they could no longer stay in a place where their daughter had been buried alive. Within a month, they had packed their belongings and fled across the border into France. They settled in a small farming community in southern France, hoping for a fresh start. For 2 years, life was peaceful. Magdalena married a local baker's son named Henry Dubois, and for a brief time, it seemed as though her curse had been left behind in Spanish soil. But in 1849, during her first pregnancy, the sleeping death returned with a vengeance. This time, the episode lasted for days. The local French doctor, more educated than his Spanish counterpart, performed every test known to medical science at the time. He held mirrors to her lips, searching for the faintest breath. He pressed his ear to her chest for hours, listening for any sign of a heartbeat. He even inserted long pins beneath her fingernails, a test believed to wake even the deepest unconscious states. Magdalena never flinched. The death certificate was signed. The funeral arrangements were made, and once again, Magdalena Dubois was lowered into foreign soil. This time, it was her husband Henry who heard the sounds. On the second night after the burial, he was kneeling by her grave, overcome with grief, when he heard it, a rhythmic tapping, like Morse code from beneath the earth. Henry was no superstitious villager. He had studied mathematics at the regional school and prided himself on rational thinking. But what he heard that night defied all logic. The tapping seemed to follow a pattern: 3 short taps, 3 long taps, 3 short taps again. Henry realized with horror that his buried wife was trying to communicate, and what she was tapping out was SOS. This time, Henry didn't hesitate. He ran through the village, gathering every able-bodied man he could find. By lamplight, they dug frantically through the French earth until they reached Magdalena's coffin. Inside, they found her in a state of complete paralysis, conscious but unable to move, her eyes wide with terror as she looked up at their shocked faces. But here's the truly terrifying part of our story: when they lifted Magdalena from her French grave, they discovered she was no longer pregnant. The shock of her burial had caused her to lose the child. Alone in the darkness of her coffin, the French authorities demanded an investigation. How could their medical examiner have made such a catastrophic error? The scandal reached as far as Paris, and once again, Magdalena and her family were forced to flee. This time crossing into Switzerland. In the Swiss Alps, they thought they had found sanctuary. The mountain air seemed to agree with Magdalena, and for 3 blissful years, she lived without a single episode of the sleeping death. She gave birth to a healthy daughter, and the family began to believe that perhaps the curse had finally been broken. They were wrong. In 1852, at the age of 28, Magdalena experienced her most severe episode yet. This time, the cataleptic state lasted an entire week. The Swiss doctors were thorough to the point of obsession. They subjected her seemingly lifeless body to every conceivable test. They applied burning materials to her skin. They exposed her to the bitter alpine cold. They even performed what would today be considered minor surgical procedures, all in an attempt to provoke any sign of life. Nothing worked. After 7 days of examination, even the most skeptical Swiss physician was convinced that Magdalena Dubois was without question dead. The burial was held on a bitter December morning in 1852. The Swiss cemetery was carved into the mountainside, and the ground was so frozen that it took the gravediggers 2 full days to dig deep enough into the rocky soil. Magdalena was buried deeper than she had ever been buried before, under 6 feet of frozen Swiss earth. This time, there was no family member keeping vigil, no one listening for sounds from below. Henry had grown ill from grief and exhaustion, and their young daughter was too small to understand what had happened to her mother. For 5 days, Magdalena lay alone in her Swiss grave, conscious but paralyzed, trapped in a hell that few human beings have ever experienced. It was an avalanche that saved her life. A massive snowslide had buried several homes in the village, and rescue workers were digging frantically to reach survivors. In the chaos, no one initially noticed the strange sounds coming from the cemetery. But, as the rescue efforts continued through the night, several workers began to hear what sounded like muffled cries for help coming from beneath the graves. The rescue team's leader, a man named Klaus Weber, made a decision that would be considered madness by today's standards. He ordered his men to excavate the newest grave, despite protests that it was impossible for anyone to survive 5 days of burial in frozen ground. What they found defied all logic and medical understanding. Magdalena was not only alive, but had somehow managed to create a small air pocket within her coffin. The scratches on the coffin lid told the story of her 5-day battle for survival. She had methodically scraped away at the wood with her broken fingernails until she had created tiny holes that allowed precious air to seep into her tomb. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. When they lifted Magdalena from her Swiss grave, they found that she was completely paralyzed from the waist down. The combination of cold, oxygen deprivation, and the psychological trauma of her 3rd burial had damaged her nervous system permanently. The Swiss authorities were mortified. How could their advanced medical system have failed so catastrophically? The case became an international sensation, with doctors traveling from across Europe to examine this woman, who had been buried alive in 3 different countries, and somehow survived them all. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened next would cement Magdalena's place in medical history forever. In 1853, Renowned German neurologist Dr. Friedrich Müller arrived in Switzerland to study Magdalena's condition. Dr. Müller had been researching catalepsy for decades and believed he might hold the key to preventing future tragedies. Like Magdalena's, through months of careful observation and experimentation, Dr. Müller developed what he called the Swiss Protocol, a series of medical tests specifically designed to detect signs of life. In cases of extreme catalepsy, the protocol included monitoring the patient for a minimum of 72 hours, testing for electrical activity in the nervous system, and, most importantly, placing a bell system inside any coffin of a suspected catalepsy victim. The bell system was Dr. Müller's masterpiece. A string was attached to the buried person's hand, connected to a bell above ground. If the person awakened underground, they could ring for help. This system, inspired directly by Magdalena's ordeal, would later be adopted by cemeteries across Europe and eventually around the world, but Dr. Müller's research also revealed something far more disturbing about Magdalena's case. Through careful analysis of her medical history and the testimony of those who had witnessed her burials, he calculated that Magdalena had spent a total of 12 days and nights buried alive across her 3 countries. 12 days of conscious terror, trapped in wooden boxes beneath foreign soil. The psychological toll was immense. Magdalena began experiencing what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. She couldn't bear to be in enclosed spaces, suffered from constant nightmares, and developed an overwhelming fear of sleep itself. Terrified that she might slip back into the death-like state that had already cost her so much, her physical condition continued to deteriorate as well. The nerve damage from her Swiss burial had left her permanently disabled, and the repeated oxygen deprivation had affected her cognitive abilities. The vibrant young woman, who had once been known for her beauty and intelligence, was now a shadow of her former self. In 1855, Dr. Müller published his groundbreaking research on catalepsy, with Magdalena's case serving as the centerpiece of his work. The publication, titled "The Woman Who Died 3 Times," became required reading in medical schools across Europe and established new protocols for determining death that would save countless lives in the decades to come. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Magdalena's story is what happened to those 3 graves. In Spain, France, and Switzerland, 3 headstones still bear her name. The Spanish grave, where she was buried for 3 days, reads Magdalena Reyes, taken too soon. The French grave, where she spent 2 terrifying nights, is marked Magdalena Dubois, mother and wife. And the Swiss grave, where she endured 5 days of frozen hell, simply states, Magdalena, survivor. Dr. Müller's final report on Magdalena's condition, published in 1856, contained one last shocking revelation. Through his extensive testing, he had discovered that Magdalena's cataleptic episodes were triggered by extreme emotional stress. Her first burial in Spain had been preceded by the death of her father. Her second burial in France had occurred during her pregnancy, a time of great anxiety, and her final burial in Switzerland had happened just days after she had learned that her sister Maria, the one person who had believed she was alive in that first Spanish grave, had died of tuberculosis. The cruel irony was that the very trauma of being buried alive was what caused the condition that led to her being buried alive. Again, each burial made the next one more likely, creating a vicious cycle that Dr. Müller termed cataleptic recursion. Magdalena Reyes died for the final time in 1857 at the age of 33 in a Swiss sanatorium. But this time, Dr. Müller was there to ensure she was truly gone. Her body was monitored for 5 full days before burial, and her coffin was equipped with an air tube, a bell system, and even a small window that allowed observers to check on her remains. She was buried for the 4th and final time in that same Swiss cemetery where she had endured her longest and most terrible ordeal. But this time, there were no sounds from below ground, no desperate scratching or rhythmic tapping. This time, Magdalena Reyes was truly at rest. The protocols developed from her case went on to save thousands of lives across Europe and beyond. The phrase "saved by the bell" is often attributed to boxing, but many historians believe it actually originated from the bell systems installed in cemeteries following Dr. Muller's research into Magdalena's case. Today, if you visit those 3 cemeteries in Spain, France, and Switzerland, you'll find that all 3 of Magdalena's original graves have been preserved as historical monuments. Each bears a plaque explaining her story, and each serves as a reminder of how much medical science has advanced since the 1850s. But locals in all 3 locations will tell you the same thing. On certain nights, when the wind is just right, you can still hear the sound of scratching coming from beneath the ground. Perhaps it's just the settling of old wooden coffins, or the scurrying of small animals through cemetery grounds, or perhaps somewhere in the darkness below, Magdalena Reyes is still trying to claw her way back to the surface, still fighting the battle that defined her short, tragic life. The girl who was buried alive in 3 countries became a legend that transcends borders. A story that reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural creatures or human villains, but the limitations of our own understanding. Magdalena's legacy lives on, not just in medical textbooks, but in every safety protocol that ensures no one else will ever have to endure what she experienced in those 12 dark days beneath foreign soil. Her story asks us a question that still haunts medical professionals today. How can we be absolutely certain that death has truly occurred? And perhaps more disturbing still, how many other Magdalenas were there throughout history? People who scratched desperately at coffin lids in the darkness, with no Dr. Muller to save them, and no family members brave enough to listen. The next time you hear an unexplained sound in the dead of night, remember Magdalena Reyes, and remember that sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that actually happened.